Okay, the mask professor is on the air once more. Okay, today for our project management class, we are going to talk about managing risk. Obviously, this is something that we do all the time automatically. We manage risk in our own lives. When we drive carefully so that we have less risk. We don't let our children play with rattlesnakes to reduce risk. So it's the same when we manage a project. All right. This shows us where we are in our network of chapters for project management. I have to apologize for canceling both Tuesdays and Thursdays classes. Tuesday, we had an unexpected need to clean up the Science and Tech building since we had a suspected COVID case. And today, which is Thursday, I'm going to have to go to Albuquerque and get my sister's arm set. I hate when that happens. All right, so our learning objectives, we want to be able to describe the process, know how to identify our risks, what are the significance of the project risks, how do we use our 4 different responses to managing risk, understand what a contingency plan is and how it plays a role in our risk management, understand opportunity management, and describe different approaches to responding to opportunities in a project. To understand how using our contingency funds and time buffers are used managing risks, and recognize the need for risk management being an ongoing activity. I've spoken about this before in some different aspects of project management. There's no such thing as we set up a project management plan, we make a risk matrix, and then we just kick back for the rest of the time and nothing else is done. And how are we going to control our change process? All right, so we have 9 sections, and funny how they kind of line up with our learning objectives about what we do within the risk management process. All right, so what is risk? Risk is uncertain or chance events that planning cannot overcome or control, except that we're going to talk about how to overcome or control them. So this definition is silly on the face of it. All right, so when we have risk management, we're talking about recognizing and managing our potential unforeseen trouble spots that we may have when our project is implemented. that falls into 4 parts. First of all, what can go wrong? Second, how do we minimize that risk's impact on our project? What can we do before the risk occurs? And what do we do if an event occurs that is in our risk? All right, so this is kind of an illustration of what happens within risk. The earlier in the process, the higher the risk is of occurring, right? But over time, that is going to go down as the project progresses and we get through the delivery phase of it. The cost, now even though the risk is very high at the beginning, the cost of fixing it becomes quite low, right? We can plan and make sure that we have contingency plans for risks that occur, and the cost goes up through our process even as the chances of risks are coming down. All right, so what is the benefit of risk management? Well, for one thing, we're ready for a risk rather than having to react because we didn't think about risks. So that reduces our surprises and the possible negative consequences from risks. That is going to prepare our project manager and our project team so that we can take advantage of an appropriate risk level, right? Sometimes if a risk happens, it actually ends up turning out to be a good thing. But knowing what the risks are as much as possible in advance and preparing for them means that if they occur, the consequences are not severe. All right, so that gives us better control over the future, well, to some extent. We can then reach our project performance objectives, and hopefully we're going to stay within our budget and on time while we're doing that, even if one or more of our risks comes to fruition or comes to fruitland, which a lot fewer things do. All right, so here is our risk management process. The first step is risk identification. We're going to look at our project and say, what are sources of risk? Now, we can go really wild to where we have so many risks written down, and some of them are such low probability that they really don't make a lot of difference. For example, under ordinary circumstances, we would not put an asteroid striking our facility as one of our risks, right? The probability is so low that it doesn't seem as though spending time worrying about that would be a useful thing to put in our risk matrix. Right? So we're going to narrow that down to known risks. Right? That might be things like, will the technology we're developing perform properly? Will our competitors be starting a project like this, and will they be able to beat us to developing this successfully? Right? Will our team be able to stay on time and within budget as we do this project? All right, so those known risks now come down to our next step, which is risk assessment. So we assess those risks in terms of the severity of impact, the likelihood of their occurrence, and their controllability, right? So if we're talking about the asteroid striking our facility, well, the severity of impact would be huge for something like that. But again, the likelihood of occurrence is so low that we're ordinarily going to leave that out of any kind of risk assessment. And the controllability of the event, well, we would pretty much be helpless in the face of something like that happening, and it would be so shattering to everything around that it really wouldn't matter in terms of the risk. Now, on the other hand, think about the probability of not being able to develop a new technology. Well, that might have a tremendous severity of impact. We would look at our new technology in terms of how far away is it from technologies that we have now when we think about the likelihood of occurrence. And we would look at things like, okay, have there been successful experiments that show this technology is workable, other things of this nature. And then we would think in terms of controllability. What can we do to make it more likely that developing this new technology is controllable? All right, well, as we go through our risk assessment, we may identify new risks that need to come up here and go back through the risk identification and start the process, right? But our risk assessment comes down, and then we do step 3. What is our response going to be if this risk occurs, right? So we're going to develop strategies that would reduce whatever possible damage from that risk might occur. With that, we're going to develop contingency plans of what we are going to do if this risk happens. Okay, so we're developing a new technology. What happens if it takes longer to integrate that in our product than we thought it would? Okay, so we develop a strategy to reduce that possible damage. So with that comes development of contingency plans. Okay, well, we would enhance this part of the project and do other things that would help us solve the problem as quickly as possible and get through the crisis so that we can continue on with our project. Step 4, our risk response control. And you'll notice at every step here, we may identify new risks that need to go back up and go through the process with us, right? We shouldn't be afraid of that or worried about that, but we should definitely make sure that we're not afraid to put those new risks in and run them through the mill. All right, so step 4, risk response control. Implementing the risk strategy. We already have a strategy. We may need to tweak it a bit when we actually implement it, but we already have a strategy in place ready. We're going to keep monitoring and adjusting that plan in case it creates new risks that had not been anticipated before. And that means that we're going to have to implement the change management process if we do have to make changes in our plan. All right, so what do we do to manage our risk? The first step, as I said, is risk identification. So generate a list of possible risks. We're going to use brainstorming, problem identification, and risk profiling, right? We may have a guideline in that we already have a set of risks we have identified for every project for our organization. But we should get our team together and say, all right, what are some risks that we might have? And again, when we're brainstorming, no idea is thrown out. Every idea is written down. So someone says an asteroid striking our facility, we write that down. We may throw that out later, of course. We're going to use a risk breakdown structure in conjunction with our work breakdown structure to identify and analyze our risks. So, we're going to look at each work package and say, does this work package have a risk that that is unique to it or applies to several of our work packages across the board, and put that down. We'll have some risks that are going to apply to everything in the project, right? We're developing a new product. What are the chances that our competitors start developing this same kind of product? And if so, what are we going to do about it? All right, so we think about those big macro risks first that affect the whole project, and then we start thinking about specific events, our individual work packages. So, our risk profile is going to be a list of questions that address other areas of uncertainty in a project. All right, so here is our risk breakdown structure. You'll notice here we have the project, we have the technical aspects of the project, what are the risks on requirements, what are the risks on technology, what are the risks on the complexity and interfaces of the project, what are the risks on performance and reliability, what are the risks in creating quality in our project. External risks, oh, there we go. External risks our subcontractors and suppliers, are they going to be able to give us what we need on time at the quality we need? Regulatory, is the government in danger of changing the law or the regulations that govern what we're doing? And if so, what is our reaction going to be? The market, if we're developing a new product or service, is the market going to want that? Or are they just going to yawn? What do our customers want? Always something that we should be worried about. Is what we're doing going to be satisfactory to the customers? And is weather a factor? If we're doing a project where everything is indoors, we don't expect any major events like hurricanes or tornadoes, weather's probably not much of a factor. If we're going to be building something outdoors, weather becomes a huge consideration. Our organizational risks. What are the project dependencies? Does our project depend on another project being finished successfully, or does it depend on some work packages within our project being finished to be able to complete the project? What are our resources? Are those pretty stable, or is there a possibility that resources might be constrained even when we've thought we had tied all of that up? What about our funding? Is our project likely to be defunded during the period of performance of it? And what about our priorities? Is our project top priority? Is ours a secondary project that we might get put on hold because somebody else needs resources that we need? And what are our project management risks? Did we do really good estimating, or are we flying on a wing and a prayer? Did we do good planning, and are we ready for things that happen and are going to come up in the project? Are we controlling our project well? Damn it. Damn it isn't part of the presentation. Are we controlling our project well? Everything is going smoothly, or it's really pretty much by gosh and by golly? And our communication. Are we talking back and forth within our project team? Are we talking to our champion? Are we talking to top management and our customers? All right, so this is a partial risk profile for a product development project. Our technical requirements, are our requirements stable? In other words, are they going to be shifting during the project because we find out we can't do certain things or certain resources won't be available? Our design. Does our design depend on unrealistic or optimistic assumptions? Well, sometimes that's going to be the case, but we should build that into our risk profile. Testing. Will the testing equipment be available when needed? You could even replace, will resources be available when needed, as an important idea. Development. Is the development process supported by a compatible set of procedures, methods, and tools? More and more, management of projects and all kinds of other things are being systematized rather than just off the cuff. But we need to make sure, are our procedures, our methods, our tools up to date and ready to go for this project? Schedule. Is the schedule dependent upon the completion of other projects? Right? A huge consideration. Will we be able to finish this project if project X fails? Our budget, how reliable are our cost estimates? Our cost and time estimates are of the utmost importance when we are planning a project. Now, how did we get them? Was it just a top-down process and we're kind of, we have a very rough budget as a result? Or is it very detailed and we've spent a lot of time on it? Our quality considerations built into the design. The time to put quality in is when we build it. There's an old saying in industrial engineering, you can't inspect quality in. The management of the project. Do the people know who has authority for what? For that matter, will we have to squash somebody because they're taking on authority that they haven't been given? Our work environment. Will our people work cooperatively across the functional boundaries? I know this, I have seen being a tremendous hindrance to managing projects in the past. Our staffing. Is our staff inexperienced or understaffed? Well, sometimes we're not going to have that experienced staff, and we need to be able to mentor and teach them as we go. Hopefully we have a mixture where the inexperienced people can be mentored by people in their area who are more experienced. Our customer. Does the customer understand what it will take to complete the project? Sometimes customers have very unrealistic expectations, and we need to make sure that we educate them as much as possible about what it's going to take to complete the project in terms of time, in terms of resources, in terms of money, in terms of staffing. And our contractors, do we have any ambiguity in their contractor task definitions? In other words, have we laid everything out contractually well enough that there won't be any misunderstanding of what needs to be done? All right, so we get to step 2, which is our risk assessment. So this is a scenario analysis for event probability and impact. All right, so step 1, risk identification. We may have thrown all kinds of wild stuff into our risk identification. This is where we look at it and we say, is this a probable event and what would be the impact if this event happened. Okay, so we use this in conjunction with a couple of ideas. One is a risk assessment form, and another is a risk severity matrix. An idea that has become popular in recent years is the failure mode and effects analysis, FEMA, if you will. That's where we give every risk a value based on its impact times its probability times its detection. And we often will do a probability analysis. This is where we start talking about probabilistic decision trees, net present value, and using PERT analysis on our schedule. Of course, PERT, the project evaluation review technique I talked about during last week's class. All right, so here we have the conditions to scale our impacts of risks for our major project objectives. All right, and this is only negative impacts. So our project objective of cost, if we give it a very low or 1 if it's an insignificant cost increase, right? It costs an extra $1,000 on a project worth $100,000. We're going to call that insignificant. We're going to call that low if it's less than a 10% cost increase. Okay, so even a cost of $9,000 as a possibility on the cost, we would still just rate that as low. Moderate would be a 10 to 20% cost increase. High would be a 20 to 40% cost increase. And very high would be over 40% cost increase. For time, there we go. For time, very low would be an insignificant time increase. A low would be under 5% time increase. Moderate would be 5 to 10% time increase. High would be a 10 to 20% time increase. And very high would be over 20% time increase. All right, for scope, very low would be scope decrease is barely noticeable. 2 is minor areas of the scope are affected. Moderate is major areas of the scope are affected. High is scope reduction is unacceptable to our sponsor. And very high is the project end item is effectively useless. Okay, so we definitely don't want to be there. With quality, Very low is quality degradation is barely noticeable. Low would be only very demanding applications are affected. Moderate, quality reduction requires sponsor approval. High would be quality reduction unacceptable to sponsor. And very high is project end item is effectively useless. All right, so this gives you an idea of how we would score impacts for cost, time, scope, quality. All right, so here is a risk assessment form where they talk about, all right, interface problems, well, the likelihood is a 4, the impact is a 4, and the detection difficulty is a 4. When do they expect that to happen? During conversion of the various elements of the project into the integrated project. System freezing, likelihood is 2, impact would be 5, detection difficulty 5, that would be during startup of the project. User backlash, likelihood is a 4, impact is a 3, detection difficulty is a 3, and when would be during post-installation, when the users are actually being trained to use it. Hardware malfunctioning, likelihood is a 1. They are expecting the hardware to pretty much be reliable. The impact, though, would be a 5, and detection difficulty would be a 5. We would see that during installation. All right, so here is how these have been put into a risk severity matrix. All right, so anything that's in green is great, but you'll notice none of these 4 that we just looked at is in the green. User backlash is in the yellow along with hardware malfunctioning, but interface problems and system freezing are major risks and must be managed very carefully. All right, so what do we do for step 3, our risk response development? Well, essentially there are 4 things we can do. The first is we mitigate the risk. We reduce the likelihood that that adverse event will occur, or we reduce the impact of that adverse event if it does occur. The second is avoiding risk. Change the project plan to eliminate the risk or condition. Of course, some things can't be eliminated. We can transfer the risk. We can pay a premium to pass the risk to another party. This is the idea of insurance in one way or another that allows us to say, if this fails, we are going to get somebody else to pay. For example, in the movie business, companies that are going to make a movie put up a bond against the movie not being finished. And then if something happens, the star dies or some other thing happens where the movie can't be finished, the insurance company would pay off. The other way of transferring risk is to require build, own, operate, transfer provisions, which they're calling boot. Our fourth way that we can handle risk is we can accept the risk. We can say we're developing a new product, it's got new technology, it might fail, but the chances that of it failing can be weighed against the tremendous amount of profit we expect to make if it succeeds, and so we're going to accept that risk. All right, so contingency planning. A contingency plan is an alternative plan that will be used if a possible unforeseen risk event actually occurs. Also, we could call it a plan of actions that will reduce or mitigate the negative impact, the consequences of a risk event. Okay, so say you and your family are planning to go to a rodeo. You're going to go to the rodeo, but you say, you know what, let's put raincoats and umbrellas in the car, because if we get there and it's raining or even sprinkling, we don't want to sit there in the stands getting wet. Right? That would be contingency planning. And some people contingency plan more than others. For example, living out here in the West, I am so worried about getting stuck somewhere in my car that I have food, I have water, I have a blanket, I have winter clothing, so that if I get stuck somewhere a while, it doesn't quickly become an emergency situation. All right, what happens if we don't have a contingency plan? Well, that may mean that when the risk event happens, we have very slow response because we have not planned what we're going to do if it happens. When that happens, when we make those decisions under pressure, potentially they can be very dangerous or very costly to the project or to us personally. All right, so here is a risk response matrix. We have a risk event, a response, a contingency plan, a trigger for action, and who is responsible. So the interface problems, going back to the same four-part risk that we've already talked about in the risk matrix and so on. Interface problems, we'll mitigate that by testing the prototype. If we are having interface problems, we're going to do a workaround until help comes. And what is the trigger? The trigger is if we can't solve those interface problems within 24 hours, and we're going to have Niles in charge of implementing that. System freezing, mitigate, again, is test the prototype. Our contingency plan is we'll reinstall the operating system. I don't think there's anyone here that hasn't had problems with their computer freezing up or not working properly. And a lot of times, just restarting the computer or reinstalling the operating system will fix that. The trigger is if it's still frozen after an hour. Wow, they're giving it a lot longer than I would. And Emmy Lou is in charge of that one. User backlash, we're going to mitigate by having a prototype demonstration. If that risk comes about, we're going to increase the staff support, and our trigger is a call from top management. And Eddie is going to be responsible for that. If the equipment malfunctions, we mitigate that by selecting a reliable vendor. Boy, you hope you always do that. We're going to transfer some of the risk by insisting on a warranty for the hardware. The contingency plan is we order replacements for the equipment that's not working. And the trigger is if the equipment fails. And Jim is going to be responsible for that. Okay, so you can see this all proceeds very logically from identifying the risk, assessing the risk, creating contingency plans, and building our risk response matrix. All right, so when we have technical risks, what is our backup strategy if our chosen technology fails? Right? If we're developing a brand new technology, that could be a tough one. Maybe we can fall back on a proven technology and make it seem like it's more enhanced than it actually is. Another thing we could do is we could say, well, can we resolve these technical uncertainties? Has anyone else done similar work before that we can then bootstrap off? Okay. Schedule risks, if we use our Slack, that does increase the risk that we're going to have a late project finish. And we may have an imposed duration date. In other words, the project absolutely, positively has to be done at such and such a time. We may have compression of our project schedule due to a shortened project duration date. Our competitors announced they're going to bring out their product at such and such a date. It's a month earlier than our project was supposed to be finished with a similar product, and all of a sudden we're scrambling and trying to shorten our time so that we can announce first. Our cost risks, we always have time and cost dependency links. Our costs are going to increase if we take longer to solve the particular risk or event that we're talking about. We may have to have some kind of price protection risk. We have an increase in price, possibly, if our project goes longer than we expect. Funding risk is always a possibility. So we may have a change in the supply of the funds available for the project, and that may really affect whether we can implement or successfully complete a project. All right, well, sometimes an event that happens is not a severe risk or doesn't have a bad impact on our project. It may be an opportunity. So, what the first way we can do this, deal with this, is exploit the opportunity. We eliminate the uncertainty associated with an opportunity and make sure that it happens. Okay, this might happen. Well, what can we do to make it happen, because it would be something good for us? We can share an opportunity. Give some or all of our ownership to somebody else who they are best able to capture the opportunity for the benefit of a project, right? You know a friend of yours is looking for a vehicle, another friend of yours is selling a good, reliable vehicle. You tell your first friend, hey, listen, I know this guy who's selling a vehicle here. It's really pretty much like what you want. Let me give you his phone number, right? We can enhance, very much like exploiting, we do everything we can to increase the probability of that positive impact of the opportunity. Okay, well, obviously that's something we want to do. And we can accept. We know this opportunity might arise. We don't necessarily know how to exploit, share, or enhance it, but we'll take advantage of the opportunity if it happens. But we can't take action because we can't necessarily do anything, or what we could do to take advantage of it seems too complicated to take advantage of it unless it just absolutely falls in our lap. Okay, so contingency funds these are funds that are there to help us cover our project risks. The ones that we have identified through our risk management process, and those that are unknown to us. So the size of these funds is going to reflect how much risk we have in a project. Our budget reserves, well, we have reserves that we link to our identified risks in specific work packages. Right? We think there's a big risk that certain resources needed for a work package won't be available, we set aside a budget reserve and says, in case those aren't available, these funds will help us to rent or buy or make available the resources we need. And then there are management reserves. These are funds that we have to cover unforeseen risks. That could be a change in the project scope of our project, right? So we have some funds set aside, and depending on the size of the project, all of these may be lumped in together in one kind of risk fund, or they may be spread out the way they have outlined here. Time buffers are obviously the slack that we have in the process, in the project process, that would allow us to put off doing a certain activity so we can concentrate on the critical path of the project. And we can create time buffers sometimes by laddering, lagging, or using hammock activities. All right, so here we have a contingency fund estimate. This is for some project. I don't know what to tell you about it. We have a budget baseline, $500,000 for design, $900,000 for making the software, and $20,000 for testing. We have budget reserves that go along with that of $15,000 for design, $80,000 for coding, and $2,000 for testing. We add the budget baseline and the budget reserve together. We have a management reserve that comes in at that point, so that it all adds up to $1,567,000 dollars. Pardon me, my phone is bugging me. All right, so that finally brings us to step 4 in our managing risk project process, and that is risk response control. So risk control is execution of our risk response strategy, right? We monitor the triggering events that would cause a strategy to be implemented, so that if the triggering event happens, we start implementing that strategy. We implement our contingency plans, and we keep watching for new risks. If a risk occurs, that is exactly the time that once we've got the response underway, we start looking at what are new risks that might arise out of this. Part of that is we're going to have to establish a change management system. In a project, there's always going to be changes, right? The customer comes in and says, well, wait a minute, this isn't like we really thought it would be. We wanted it to be more like this. And then we would have to say, oh, okay, well, here's what we can do about that, and we would have to go through our project management process to make sure we're lined up with what needs to happen there. So that means that we are monitoring, tracking, and reporting our risk, right? Obviously, if risks come up, those go into our reports on the project. We always want to foster an open organization environment. Look, it's very tempting to do empire building and keeping things secret so that I have knowledge that no one else does, and they have to come bow down before me to find out what anything that I know. Frankly, that's just a bunch of BS. That is not a way that we can manage well. We want to be sure that we are creating a transparent environment, as transparent as we can be. Now, having said that, sometimes there are things we need to keep quiet about. For example, we're working on a project to develop a new product for our company or organization. This is something that we expect to be brand new, and nobody has really done anything quite like this before. Well, in that case, we want to be very open inside our project team with our champion or sponsor, with top management, but we want to be sure we're being we're keeping it secret from the outside world until it's time to unveil the project. Now, this is very hard in some ways. For example, engineers have a tendency to not think in terms of keeping things secret, right? They want everything to be open and above board, and while that is an admirable trait in so many ways, it becomes less admirable when we're talking about creating a secret project. All right. We want to keep repeating our risk identification and assessment activities and creating our contingency plans and so on as we go through the project. There's never a time when we just say, oh, I'm taking my foot off the gas now. And we want to make sure that we assign and document the responsibility for managing risk. All right, so when we think about our change control, what are the sources of change? Well, first of all, we might have project scope changes. Right? Our champion comes to us and says, hey, we need this new product to also do this. Or our customer comes to us and says, you know what, our competitors are already doing this, can we incorporate this into the project? Part of that is going to be, do we have to implement any of our contingency plans? Right? Are our contingency plans adequate to our risk events? And as we identify changes, again, we have to go back through the risk management process over and over. And sometimes there are improvement changes, right? We're going along and they come to us and they say, you know what, we don't we don't actually have to do this part of the project anymore because we now I have the ability to use this or that, or, so change is not always bad. Now, of course, that improvement change could also mean we have to go back and redo our work packages because it's a better idea, but it's also going to be more work for us now. All right, so when we do change management, first of all, we have to identify what is the proposed change, right? We have to understand that as thoroughly as when we first started defining the project. We need to go through and look at what are the effects of these proposed changes on our schedule and budget, right? Is this a simplification that's going to let us reduce our schedule and budget? Or is this something where it's going to make the end of our project better, but it means we have to do more work? We want to review, evaluate, and approve or disapprove of changes formally, right? We don't just willy-nilly change things for the sake of changing things. We want to make sure that we are changing things in a way that is going to make our project better as much as possible, or at least still an acceptable project. All right, negotiate and resolve conflicts of change, condition, and cost. All right, so maybe the change that we want to implement is going to make the project better, but it's also going to cost more. It's going to take a bit more time. So we're going to have to negotiate that either internally in our organization or with the customer to make sure that we get to what is a mutually acceptable place. We need to communicate those changes to all the parties affected. I have been on projects where I've worked on something for weeks, and then when I'm getting close to finishing it, it's been communicated to me, oh, we decided not to use that part of the project. Well, how long have you guys known? Oh, well, we decided that last week. You've got to let everybody know what's going on. We have to make sure that the people that are responsible for implementing the change know that, and that everybody knows who that is. We have to adjust our master schedule and budget. Very important. Look, we're going to have to adjust the schedule and budget all the way through the project, from the beginning of the project to the end. Some things will turn out to be easier and cheaper than we thought. Some things may turn out to be much more expensive and take longer than we thought. We need to track the changes that we're going to implement and their implementation. All right, so here is our change control process as they visualize it in this flow chart. We have a change that originates, right? Doesn't matter where it originates, we have a possible change. We submit a change request form. That request form goes to be reviewed, and then it is either approved and we update our plan of record and distribute to everyone, let everyone know what's going on, or it's not approved, maybe it goes back to the change request and is submitted in a different form, or maybe it's just utterly rejected and cast into outer darkness where there's wailing and gnashing of teeth. I know I hate when that happens. All right, so when we have that kind of a change control system, that means that things that don't matter are get discouraged because there's a formal process. I have worked on projects and in organizations where it was okay for a manager just to wander in and say, oh yeah, why don't you guys do this? And that was the whole change control process. And of course, often those kind of off-the-cuff changes meant a big change in what had to be done, what were the priorities, what would the schedule and the budget be. We need to maintain the cost of our changes in a log and a log about our changes in general. We need to make sure that our work breakdown structure and our performance measures are maintained, that we don't just let those go to hell because one change came in. We need the allocation and our budget and management reserve funds. When we spend those, we've got to track that. If you get to the end and you can't say where the money was spent, prepare yourself for an audit or even possibly being fired. We want to make sure our responsibility for implementation is crystal clear. Everybody has to know who is in charge of implementation and what they're doing. The effect of the changes has to be visible to everybody, right? Again, we want a transparent project management process. Our implementation of the change has to be monitored and its effects recorded. All of this has to go into the change monitoring log and into the reports that are being sent to higher ups. All right, and if it's an actual change in scope, that we make sure that that is reflected in our baseline and in our performance measures, right? It's very possible, even easy, to be in a situation where we aren't worried about that, and then when we get to the end of the project, we can't account for things, our schedule and or our budget is a mess. No, come on. We got to keep updating the whole time we're doing project management. All right, so here we have a possible sample change request form. All right, so it's the Irish-Chinese Culture Exchange. It has a request number. It is originated by Jennifer MacDonald, sponsored by the Irish Embassy, the date, and who was this change requested by? And that is the Chinese Culture Office in this case. So the description of the requested change request river dancers to replace small Irish dance group. Request one combination dance with rivers dancers and China ballet group. Okay. The reason for the change: river dancers will enhance the stature of the event. The group is well known and well loved by the Chinese people. And then we have the areas of impact for that proposed change. So it's a change in scope and in cost. The disposition is it's going to be approved as amended. The priority is urgent. Funding source is the customer. And then we have the sign-offs at the bottom here. Okay, so again, a formal process. That way, if the change is too small or really doesn't matter, people will be scared off by the formal process of having to go through it. All right, so here we have a document that is a log of different changes that have been brought in on a project. Okay, so it looks like this is a building project, right? So change request number, description, the reference document, the date received, date submitted, the amount, the status, and comments. Okay, so you'll notice the amounts are negative in the case of our first one, sewer work offset, right? But sometimes the amount is a positive amount. Okay, and there you have it. Our key terms. Now, it's important enough that I think we should go through this PERT and PERT stimulation. All right, so program evaluation review technique. It, once again, it assumes that our activity durations are not fixed by the heavens, but can be changeable depending on different assumptions, right? They're saying it follows a beta distribution. I've also seen people describe this as having a triangular distribution. So we use 3 time estimates for every activity. There's optimistic, pessimistic, and most likely, which they call a weighted average to represent activity durations. I would say the PERT estimate is actually the weighted average that represents our duration activities. Man, that slide is just a bit of a mess. All right, so any given activity has an optimistic number here, a most likely number here, and a pessimistic number here, right? Where our project we're describing as more of a straight bell curve. So we do our PERT estimate, our PERT weighted average, by saying that our weighted time estimate is equal to our optimistic, plus 4 times our most likely plus our pessimistic divided by 6. We can figure our variability in activity time estimates by saying our standard deviation of our PERT time estimate is going to be equal to our pessimistic minus our optimistic divided by 6. Our standard deviation for our project is going to be equal to the standard deviation of total project estimate time equals the square root of the summation of all our individual standard deviations squared of each activity added together. All right, so here we have some activity times and their variances. So we have the optimistic time, the most likely time, the pessimistic time, and our PERT estimate time for each of these. So the activity from 1 to 2, from 2 to 3, 2 to 4, and on down. Oh, bloody hell. Right, and then we have our variance of each of these. We can use the equation below. Boy, I hope there's an equation. Hell of a job. We don't actually have our equation, but we can get our z value by figuring our standard deviation for each activity. All right, so here is our network for the earlier table that was shown to you. And so they have figured out figuring out the Z formula from our time of starting minus our time of ending divided by the variance, and so we get a probability. Since I don't know if you have studied statistics at all, probably that's less than useful. All right, well, so there you go. I will post this video immediately, although how you will know that is a good question, because you won't see me say this until I've posted the video and you watch it. So have fun, and this is the masked professor signing off. Have a good day.